Well, we're into the swing of summer sewing at this point, and I found the cutest dress. I'm very excited to make it. It is the Hallon Dress by Paradise Patterns. It's a PDF. They have beautifully made patterns. I like the way they have their directions. I think it's a well constructed company as far as their patterns go. And they're cute. I believe they're in Hawaii. So we're going to work on view A, which is the dress with the ruffle. You have to, it's up to you how you choose to do this. I printed out the whole thing. The first time I did a PDF recently, I printed the whole thing out, lined everything up, taped it together, traced it off on my paper. And then when I went to put it away, I had all of this printer paper. It was heavy, it was difficult to put away, so I cut everything back apart. So I had my original, put it in my little clear plastic zippy, and stored it. And I thought, that is a lot. I know people use a projector and can project. I own one, but it's an old one. I want to get a new, smaller, lighter one. You can adjust the projector. All of the patterns, or all the good patterns, will have a thing that says this square should be 1 inch or 3 centimeters or whatever. And so you can adjust your projector and measure it to make sure that you're getting your scale correct. But what I did this time, because this pattern company, I pull out a pattern piece here, that'll make it easy to see. On their patterns, they're well labeled, so you know where it goes, because they have a little key and a schematic for you. They all have a little triangle on all 4 corners so that you can perfectly line them up. So what I did when I was doing this is I would lay out my first pattern piece, trace it off, and then I would draw the little triangle. So if you see on my paper pattern, you can see the little triangles here. And so I could just slide one in, slide one out, slide one in, slide one out. And I had no problem. I have allergies. I do have that problem. I had no problem keeping everything lined up, and I didn't have to tape everything together. And it was pretty easy because I'm working with, it's exam table paper for doctor's offices. You can buy it in bulk online for not very much. I have a huge box of it, and I really go through it. I love this stuff. So that's what I use. You can see through it, but it's still a nice weight. Easy to draw on, easy to work with. It comes crepe or not creped. I've accidentally bought creped before, but I prefer the not crepe, the plain paper best. So you're going to trace off your pattern. Now, if you are sewing this with a narrower fabric, the center back will have to be cut into 2 pieces instead of on the fold because it's just too wide. It's a nice full pattern. I'm so excited for this. I think it's going to be so cute. This is a great wear, comfy, throw over your swimsuit kind of dress. Last week's t-shirt, if you watched last week, that t-shirt is to go under this dress because it's backless. And I'm not going to wear it backless. It would be cute though if you had a pretty lacy little bralette to put under it. Like, you could definitely wear it lots of ways. So it would also be cute to throw a cardigan over. This is my fabric. It is almost a seersucker. It has the little plissé gathers in it, little puckers in it. This is from Hobby Lobby. I bought a stripe, and I like it because the stripe goes up and down. You got a nice vertical stripe, which is slimming. It has lots of nice, soft colors, and it almost looks like a madra without it being a plaid. And that t-shirt I made last week matches this peachy pink in here really well. So we're going to cut out of this. It should be pretty easy. There's a lot of bias. It's pretty much sewn together, trimmed with bias. Throw it on, you've got a cute dress. So we'll see. I'm excited to try it out. I forgot, it does have a little bust line dart, so it fits nicely up here, and then it just sort of hangs, which should be really attractive too. So let's get cutting. Don't forget to pre-treat your fabric. And by pre-treat, you hear me say this all the time, I serge or sew in some way, use pinking shears along the cut edge, throw it through the washer and the dryer like you're going to treat it once it's a completed garment, so that if there's any change or shrinkage, it will be taken care of before the garment is made. Whenever possible when laying out, I pin down all pattern pieces before cutting to make sure that I have enough fabric and that I don't accidentally misplace something and then I'm unable to get out an important piece. Because I have 45-inch wide fabric, instead, it's actually probably more like 42, it's pretty narrow. Instead of 60, the back pattern piece is actually placed in two different areas. You can't even fold it either direction or stack one on top of the other. They're kind of slid halfway through, so it's impossible to lay everything out and cut it in this case if you're working with a narrow fabric. So I'm going to be cutting as I go. They have really good directions for how it should be laid out so that you can get every little bit of your fabric out and not be wasteful. So do look at their directions for how to cut out. I'm doing the one that has the ruffle at the bottom. So the dress portion is a little shorter, but then you need to leave place to put all those ruffle pieces in. So there is a difference between cutting view A and view B also. Okay, I'm stopping. I'm not through cutting out. My fabric will not get it in the 3.5 yards that I purchased, which it should, but because of the narrowness, it says at 45 it should get it out. It's not going to. It just won't. I cannot get all of the ruffle pieces and the bias pieces and my front. It just won't happen. So I'm gonna head back to the store, buy another piece of fabric, pre-shrink it. So we'll see if I even get this completed today. I may look completely different. If I'm able to get it all purchased, pre-shrunk, and back, I will work on it today. So we'll see. I don't want my stripes changing. That's one of the things that's making me go back and get fabric. If I lay it out, if you have directional fabric, you cannot cut it out in the 3.5 yards. You need more fabric, you just do. Mine is directional in that it's stripes, and there's not a lot of matching, but I don't want my stripes to go from vertical to horizontal when I go from the dress to the ruffle, which is what will happen. So I'm going to buy more fabric so that I can have my stripes on my ruffle also going up and down. I think I would prefer that. I've been thinking it through a lot, trying to decide how I want it, and I just don't want a horizontal stripe anywhere. So, back eventually. Okay, I'm back. They had just a little bit left of my fabric, thankfully, so I got another yard, and with that I can get my ruffles for the bottom. Because my fabric that I chose is just narrow enough, the front ruffle that's supposed to be cut on the fold won't fit. So I'm going to have a seam in my front ruffle as well as my back ruffle. It is what it is. When I go out, I seldom go through a drive-through other than I love a good drink. So Giant Diet Cherry Limeade is my sewing fuel for today. Okay, I'm gonna just finish cutting. I don't think there's anything really exciting about this. I do have my bias strips to cut out, but it's all very straightforward. The directions are good in the pattern, and the next time you see me, most likely will be over the sewing machine. Okay, I'm completely cut out. I went back, bought more fabric, pre-treated it, ate lunch, made another t-shirt, which you saw last week. I tacked it on the end of last week's video. So the lemon shirt I made in that time period while I was waiting on my fabric to pre-treat. So anyway, all that's done. The reason I had to buy more fabric was not the pattern's fault, but my own. I chose to do a stripe, and I also chose a fabric that's very narrow. It's so narrow that when I went with a narrower fabric and on the fullest size, or one of the fuller sizes, it just wasn't going to work. So my fabrication did not meet the requirements that the pattern put out for me. So that it was not the pattern's fault, it was my fault not paying attention and not buying enough fabric. So if you choose a directional fabric, a napped fabric, anything like that, buy extra. If you cannot flip your pattern pieces, including your ruffles, in any direction, you need more fabric. The ruffles are extra long. So for me, they would not fit in any of my scraps of fabric that I had. So I had to buy extra, and even when I bought 1.25 yards extra, the ruffle was still longer. I ended up having to put seams in my ruffle, which you will see, to make it fit. And I also could not, I wanted the ruffle to be with the lengthwise grain. I wanted my stripe to go up and down. Could not do it, so my stripe will be going around for the ruffle. It's just the way it is for this project. Again, not a problem with the pattern, it's just my fabrication choices. So, with all that said, let's put in a dart. If you haven't done a dart before, click the iCard to see the basics of a dart. We're going to put both bust slide darts in really quickly and move on to the next thing. Okay, we're going to do this according to the pattern directions, but I will tell you that I think there might be a little bit of an easier way. Not that it's, yeah, I think it's easier. Okay, so we've done our dart. Once your dart is done, we need to give it a little press. I'm sure I have the front here. Depending on your fabric, be careful when pressing, because the folded edge of that dart, when you press it in, you can actually leave an impression on the outside of the fabric. So I press mostly at the seam line and not too much elsewhere, just to get it. The iron always turns off on me. Step one was the dart. After the dart, it has a sewing our back pieces together if you have two back pieces and didn't get them on the fold. What I would do, if it were me, because the front and the back have bias pieces that are done independently, I would sew that bias piece on before this became a big circle and it was flat and it was easier to sew. So I personally would from step one, sewing your dart in, step two, I'd be putting a neckline bias on. That's not how they have you do it. So once darts are in, we're going to take our backs and we're going to sew the backs together on the center back seam, if you had to cut out two like I did. And I also totally messed this up. Full disclosure. The center back is supposed to be along the straight of grain and the side seam is not. And I did it backwards. I put the side seam on the straight of grain and not the center back. So if you see, and it wouldn't be that noticeable to you, but if you look at my stripe, see how my stripe runs off? Which will look fine when sewn, but it does change the shape. It changes the way it hangs. Fortunately, this is a full drapey garment with gathers across the back, so it's going to hang beautifully and be fine. I'm just letting you know so that you're aware that mine is going to be a little different in that way because Stacy messed up. So we're just going to sew this center back seam. This pattern has 5/8 inch seam allowance and they have directions for doing French seams. If you haven't done a French seam, their directions are pretty good. You can follow along. I have an iCard, I'll put up in the iCard my French seam tutorial so you can see what a French seam is. I use the 5/8 inch information, as if you had a 5/8 inch seam, you don't. You have a 1/2 inch, so you'll just have to adjust your numbers accordingly if you want to do a French seam. I am not doing a French seam, however, I'm just going to serge this together. So I'm going to serge together my back. So here's my back. You can see how I intentionally cut it so that the stripes would run into each other. I didn't do a super fussy job of worrying about matching it up, but I got it pretty stinking close so that when this is across the back, even though there's going to have gathers, it's going to look nice and lay nice. Okay, so I'm going to press that. Then we're going to go ahead and it has you do your next side seams before you go on. We have gather stitches to do on this, and it's easier to do if you haven't sewn your side seam. I'm going to go ahead and do that. I just think that it's harder to do all of these things when it's constructed as a complete garment. Yeah, you really don't need your garment together until you're ready to do the sleeve, which is step 16. You could work on these independently until step 16. You could have your backs together and your fronts together and work on each of those things, and then step 16 or before step 16, marry your front to your back and do your little strappies at your arm straps, your sleevey straps. They're not sleeves, your bias straps. To gather, there's two little notches on the pattern that show where you're gathering in the back to get that pretty drape. So I'm going to go ahead and run those gathers. You can work with flat pieces for most of the bias if you don't sew your side seams. So I'm deviating. I'm just going to tell you now, I'm going to deviate. I'm going to let you know what step I'm at, but I'm not going to have my side seams together yet. Just not. I just think it makes a lot more sense. So Stacy's deviating. No surprise. I do it all the time. All right, we have darts. We have a center back seam. We have gathers across that back neckline from notch to notch. I'm going to I've done steps 6 and 7 at the back. So step 8 is putting our back bias on. It looks like this. And it has a wonderful little chart. Let me get this out of the way. On step 8, it has this chart that says what the total length of your neckline should be. And that is from little pokey point to little pokey point, not just the gathers. So if I take, and so for the size I'm doing, I'm doing a 16, so that's 27 inches. So I've got, see I've got 2 little pins right here, one here and one here. Roll this way, okay. Pin right here and right here. 2 little pins. And so this neckline, when gathered, should fit that. And then we can apply our bias. And this bias, if we cut our little points off, it's 27 inches. So it's 20, if I went straight across here on each end and measured it, yep, it's exactly 27 inches. The pattern maker has done a lot of effort to get all of these pieces very accurate and very measured out for you. They really have worked hard at it. This is the tedious stuff that makes pattern making not fun for a lot of people. So we're going to start our little gather lines. Okay, let's press our bias in half. And when you do this, it'll make it much easier for you to see how those ends no longer, they say stretch a little. Boy, you have to be careful about doing that because you can misshapen your bias where you have skinny and thick parts. So be paying close attention to your bias if you do the stretch a little direction there. Bias pressed in half. Now I'm finding its center back again. Now we're going to pin this on, right sides together. When you're sewing your bias on, I'm sure this is going to be done for the neckline too. Let me find the neck for the front neckline. So here's the right side of my garment. I'm going to pin the bias to the wrong side. You can see my stitch here. So we're putting the raw edges together, but I have my bias on the inside right now. So what happens when they do it this way is that when you press and fold over, then it's folded to the right side, and it is very pretty. That is the excellent way to do it. We want to make sure this is 27 inches. So we're going to pull and gather to 27 inches. You want to pull your gathering in along your bias and then make sure that they hang nice and straight and flat so that when you straight stitch it on, you don't get any little puckers, tucks, or folds. That's what that means by in a bad way. So I'm going to go ahead and get this pinned on, get my gathers in, and I'll show you what it looks like and we'll stitch it in. And while I'm at it, I'm going to do the same thing for the front because they're treated exactly the same way. Okay, back in a minute to do both of those neckline biases at the sewing machine. I have my bias pinned on. My bodice, again, the bias is pinned to the back side. It's folded in half, so it's right side either way, but the bias is not the bodice. So here's my dress front with the bias pinned on, and here is my dress back with the bias pinned on, so I'm ready to sew both of them. According to the directions, they say whatever you end up with for your width of bias, your seam allowance will be 1/4 of that, which should be about 1/4 of an inch, which is what I'm going to sew. So I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch around for both of those, and then they have us trimming them off. Now it's a little confusing the way they say to do it. I'm just going to go to, on step 13, it says, imagine you can see the edge of the armhole and cut the bias tape at this angle on both sides. So what you're really doing is following the shape up, and you want that angle, so you're going to trim away some of your bias once it's all done, so you come back to this same angle because we're going to be covering that with another piece of bias. I will show you that up close when I go to trim it because it is a little bit of an eyeballing thing and you don't want to lose anything or you're going to end up with your straps wrong. The other thing it does say in the directions, which is I think important, the more you gather the back, the higher the back. So if you don't want a really low back on this, a low backless dress, gathered up tighter, that actually brings the back up. It also makes the hemline come up. So wherever it comes up on your back, it will also come up at the hem. So you have to think about that too. If you want it really long, but also not to be too backless, then you need to maybe lengthen it in the center back to adjust for that. Anyway, I'm going to sew both of these at 1/4 inch and I'll show you the next step.
Ordinary citizens, taken out of their lives for 6 weeks, ripped from their lives to sit in this court.
Here's the front neckline. I've pressed the seam where it's stitched. So this is the right side of the garment. You can see the stitching is currently on that side, and then we will fold over to cover all of that and stitch it down. Now, you can whip stitch this if you want to, but top stitching would be personally how I would recommend it. You want to turn it just past the old stitching line. So see how it'll just go past that, and then we're going to top stitch it. Go ahead and come up a little ways. We're going to come back and trim this and after we stitch. So go ahead and just do that all the way across, and you're going to do that for the front and the back. Here's how the back looks before I press it. So this is going to get pulled up and pressed, and the back has all of those the gathering lines. So once that's done, we'll pull out the gathering lines and top stitch both of those down. This is the facing or the bias pressed over before stitching, just so you can see how it looks. Isn't that pretty? And I've done the same thing for the back. So now we're ready to stitch. Here's the back, pressed and ready to go. Stitching the bias neckline on with the pieces flat, as in the front and the back not attached, is much simpler. If I were doing this and they were attached, I would have the whole back piece on these sides and hanging off here. I just think it's much easier if you have a flat single piece to do this section, because you don't need the side seam to do this part. Then come back. After this, we'll be doing our side seam. We have got a pretty back with its facing or its bias on, and a pretty front with its bias on. I have pulled out basting stitches and stuff, but they were in there. Isn't that cute? So now we're going to sew our side seams. Now, this is where I did it out of order. This would have been, let me go back and look at our steps. This would have been like steps 3 and 4. Yeah, so steps 3 and 4. I skipped steps 3 and 4, went forward, did all the little neckline pieces. Now I'm coming back to do steps 3 and 4 so we can move on to step 16. I know that sounds confusing, but if you are just sewing along with me, you will hopefully you will see that it was much easier to sew that bias on with it nice and flat and not in a circle, because you had both pieces together. So we're going to sew those. If you're doing the French seam, they have directions here, or you can, I gave you the link for a French seam. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and serge it. It has a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm doing at the serger, so it's going to shave off a little bit, and then we'll come back and we're going to do our little armholes. Our front and back bias, our side seams, it's all put together, so I'm showing you from the front. Here it is from the back. You can see it's lower. So now I have not yet trimmed my little armhole things. Let's grab some scissors. So it says in the directions, trim it. Really what it's saying is trim it so that it follows the line, and you're keeping the same shape as the armhole. We're just going to trim that off on all of our little armholes, because we're going to come back now, on our necklines, because we're going to come back and do our armholes. I want to make sure, if you're uncertain, you can lay them on top of each other too. Make sure that everything comes out the same. Yeah. All right, so now that that is done, I've got all those little pieces trimmed off. We are going to take our last 2 bias pieces, which are our armhole pieces, and we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to fold in half and press, and then we're going to make the little circle. We're going to combine our edges, but they have us press it first. So let's get this pressed. Okay, so I have one pressed in half. And then it shows us taking our odd little ends, they're little pointy ends. Okay, so we're going to do this. So what ends up happening, can you see this? And you don't want to go very corner to very corner, because where you stitch at will have an issue. You actually are offset just a little bit. You need to move over a seam allowance width. So this is our armhole. We have pressed it in half, and then we've opened it up, and here's our ends, and we've got it. Think of this as the wrong side and this is the right side. Okay, so can you see how it's hanging off each end? The little point is just a little bit. That's our seam allowance width, because I'm going to sew this at a 3/8 of an inch. So you want to have this hanging off 3/8 of an inch. We're going to do a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And once that's done, you can see this is going to come back around and fold, and it'll be just right. All right, let's do our 3/8. And there is some stretch and bias, so you might have it, you might find that you're off just a little bit, but if you're off very much, you need to rip it out and fix it because it won't go together. So now we're going to fold that in half. And now we have an armhole. Now we're ready to take this to our little garment. And you're going to want this, where they come together, you want that to be in the underarm. You don't want to see this seam, though it blends away with my stripe. You don't even see it. But anyway, you're going to put that at the underarm, because we have a perfect circle now. So we're going to go to the underarm. Okay, so we're going to pin this to the wrong side. And then as you follow and pin, you want to make sure you've got this folded nicely. If you get your fold off weird on your bias, it's going to cause you some problems when you go to turn it to the other side. We're just not pulling, not stretching. We're just letting it lie gently. We're going to pin, pin, pin till we run out of strap on one side or run out of dress, and then we'll go to the other side and do the same thing. And you'll have part of this where you will have nothing under it. It'll just be bias. And then this will flip around just like we did before, stitch it around, and you're going to stitch all the way around. So the first time you're stitching all the way around, and that holds the bias where there's nothing under it, and it attaches it to the dress, and the next time when you flip it around, that finishes it all off. So it should be beautimous. So we're going to do that for both pieces. So I'm going to finish pinning. I'll see you back over the sewing machine where you can see some close-ups. All right, we're working on our little bias armhole here, and I just want you to see what it looks like. So this is my back where the bias finished, and it's coming up. Can you see here? This is how it looks. I want you to see that my front and back bias, look at how close they come in the armhole. Like there's just a little bitty section where they don't touch. Now it's going to look a little bit more when I get everything flipped and folded around, but for me, when I did it, this is how it came out, and I made sure that they were the same on each arm. So this is what it looks like up at the shoulder for that side, and here it is on this side. So you can see they're just about the same. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because when you look at the picture, it looks like there's a lot of armhole where it's just bias and the garment doesn't come up into it. But for me, that's not coming out that way, which is fine, because when I look at the size of the armhole, that's plenty big enough. Like I don't need it to be even more than that. So I think that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and sew both of these up at the 1/4 inch all the way around. So I'm going to do that first, then I'll show you the next step on these little armholes so we can move on to ruffles. This is my underarm, and you can kind of see this is my bias piece. So you can see the little point. I haven't trimmed it off. So you will have little pokies on each end where your bias came together. So just know that that's how it's supposed to look. And I'm just sewing around this at the 1/4 inch, just straight stitching around the complete circle. I'm starting in the underarm. It doesn't really matter where you start because it's a circle. Just start in the same place on both arms. It'll just make the stretch go the same. Okay, we have got bias sewn around our little arm bobs. So here's the front of the garment. So you can see here's a little armhole. Okay, now that we've sewn around the circle, we're going to press this. Now remember, this is attached currently to the back, so we're flipping it up. So we're going to press in towards the bias so that everything's going the right direction. And then we will fold this in half back over our old stitching line and top stitch it. Let me show you up here, because I think the place that might be the most confusing, you are working in a circle, is at the shoulder. So here we are at the shoulder. We're pressing this up inside our armhole. At the shoulder, it's going to get pressed like this. So you can see this raw edge is going into the bias. Just give it a little squirt. And then this edge is going to fold back over and get top stitched on. So there we go. I hope I'm a little concerned that I have so little difference between these two. I may like it because I know I don't want a giant long armhole, but I did not stretch my bias a lot, like they said, to kind of give it a stretch. So yours may not be quite as close together as mine are here. But for me, it's exactly what I want, because then I have a tighter armhole and a tighter fit in that area. Okay, we're gonna just press that around and stitch it. And once this is done, the bodice, or the main part of the dress, is done, and then we just have our ruffles at the bottom. So we're getting close to the end. So I'll meet you back after armholes. Okay, we're to ruffle. So I'm starting to piece my ruffle together. I did try and cut it so that I can get pretty close to lining up my stripe all the way around. You should have one front ruffle piece and two back ruffle pieces, unless you're like me and your fabric's too narrow, and then you'll end up with two fronts and two backs, which is how I am. So I'm marking my center front because I will have a seam on the center front and in the center back, just so I can keep things straight. So I'm going to go ahead and put my ruffle pieces together, and then we're going to go ahead and run gathering lines around it to attach it to the hem of the dress. Okay, so I've been gathering, trying to get my gathers nice and even all the way around. So I went ahead and hemmed the bottom of the ruffle even before I attached it. So once I straight stitch and serge this edge, the dress is done. So that's what I'm going to do now. It has 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm going to go ahead and straight stitch on the 1/2 inch and serge those edges together. I've got a few little gathers. I'm still trying to work out my gathers to get them perfect. And we'll have a ruffle. All done. It's so cute. It's super roomy and comfy. I did the size 16, so you can see how it fits me. And I'm 5'5", so you can see how long it is. It's above the floor, which is perfect. I really like the length. I think it's super fun. Great little summery sundress. This is the t-shirt from last week, so if you have not seen that video, go back and watch last week. I ended up making 3 t-shirts. Super fast and easy. Speed sew. This was not quite as fast and easy. Nothing really particularly hard. It's just time consuming. Lots of bias, lots of gathers. A giant dog who wants some attention. I've been sewing too long today, haven't I? Have I sewn too much today? She needs some time. She wants some time. Is it time for me to go down and spend with you? It is? Is it time? She's going to push me downstairs. I know! You're getting impatient. All right, I'll be back to talk about this later. I'm going to go give her some attention. Quit. Okay, I'm back. I got the dog taken care of. You know what I forgot? A pocket. I may have to open it up and put a pocket in the side. I'm so disappointed I didn't think to do that, because I do need a pocket. Just so you can see the back. This is the back and it's loose. So that's something to consider when wearing it. Same with under the arm. So if you were wearing this braless, you might consider that. Or you probably need like a bandeau, swimsuit, something like that. See you next week for another fun video.